As a psychologist, I came first in working with the issue of human rights when I started working in the prisons. That was almost 30 years ago, and I started working in Delhi's Tihar prisons in a ward for severely violent offenders and people who were there as under trials for different heinous crimes. Now, that's a long journey, and when I start off talking of a long journey, many things come to mind. One is that I was not exposed to political psychology at that time. I worked in a center for traumatized individuals who suffered from different psychotic disorders, and it was at the invitation of the prison director at that time, who wanted some psychological help and said that the prison does not have a fund for a psychologist, an official psychologist. So would I mind that as an NGO I could come over and work? So I said yes, though I was not sure as to what kind of issues I can really work with, because I did not have experience in that. I had a doctorate in psychology with clinical psychology, and I had been trained in doing grief work with people by Elizabeth Kubler-Ross. So I thought of starting grief work in the prisons, and we were not sure how it would be. The Indian prison is not like a Western prison where people stay in cells. There are 300, 400 people living in a large hall, and my work began by giving a talk about some topic which they liked and asking them that if they wanted to talk to me. Initially, nobody wanted to talk to me, and whenever they would talk also, it was not about symptoms and signs, but more as to how to get out of the prison. So I felt that I was wasting my time. Two things changed. One was that one day there was this person he was one of the head warders, and he did grief work with me, and he felt unusually calm. He said that I did not beat up my fellow prisoners after a minor argument, and everybody told me that I have changed. So I realized that there is the power of change even in some of the very hardened criminals. The second thing that changed me was to realize that how they are politically marginalized, like their cases are not heard. Many of them were under false cases. Many of them talked about how policemen had had got confessions from them under torture, and that was very shocking for me, because the conventional idea is that people who have done wrongs go to prisons, who are criminals. Yes, they go to, but there are also many innocent people who go to prisons, and that is something that started changing my perspective and bringing me more to human rights. As I worked more and more into into the prisons, I was also invited by the police at that time to work with survivors of heinous crimes. So I began to see both sides. The criminals on one hand, the suspects who had committed the crime, that included everyone from terrorists to homicide, people who had committed homicide, sexual assaulters, rapists, and I also saw their victims. And somewhere what I found is that somewhere both of them are suffering, right? It was not just the victims who were suffering, the perpetrators were also suffering. They were also troubled inside. And that is something that slowly brought me more and more into the political domains, the political realms of psychology. The third shift came when, as far as working with victims was concerned, many times the survivors, victims would talk to me about things that they hadn't talked to police. That often became an important part of the crime, in solving the crime. So in interrogation, for example, people would share more things with me than they would share with the police officer under torture, right? So that opened many a new thing for me. One is that India, still today, torture is the investigation. When somebody asks me that, why do you have torture as part of investigation? I say, no, torture is the investigation, right? I also find that many victims, they started talking about themselves in a way that they had not talked to a police officer. The reason being that trauma, the way they were dealt with, nobody had addressed their trauma. So once the trauma was dealt with, more information, more things came to their mind, which they shared with me. And for many perpetrators, when they shared with me, they said that we are sharing with you because we don't feel insulted by you. So if you talk to perpetrators as equal, I mean equal, it doesn't mean that somewhere you respect the perpetrator, but you separate the person from the behavior and you make it clear that it is the behavior that you are after, and you communicate to the person that if he or she shares the behavior with you, they will feel lighter and better. They start sharing on their own, right? So this was an important thing for me to learn, that yes, to get information from people, you need to be tough but also compassionate. You get more information out of that. This was not particularly probably liked by many people because torture or interrogation or the way things are dealt with in criminal justice system is an industry by itself. Now, as they shared things with me, it also became a duty for me to write reports and submit it to the police and to the courts. So I had, over a period of time, I submitted hundreds of reports and to the police, and sometimes on being asked directly by the court. And I had to go and testify in the courts about what had transpired from a psychological perspective. Now, this was something totally new in India. There is, according to the Indian Penal Code or CRPC, there is no role for a psychologist to define. Like in many other countries, psychologists are routinely used by criminal justice system to testify in the courts, to interrogate people, to talk to survivors. There was no such thing as that. So it was like we were going on a path, and it was a very illuminating path. It taught us a lot of things that we should do and we should not do. I learned to talk in a legal language, which I was not. I would talk in a behavioral language most often. And one of the deepest satisfaction was to see that because of what I testified, sometimes a case could be taken to its logical conclusion. The suspect could be punished, and the survivors, they felt good inside that at last justice had been done to them. And this is what I also saw, that how psychologists can help in the criminal justice system and also help the criminal justice system to evolve and become humane, become compassionate, and bring rule of law. Now, it is not something that I could institutionalize. I could do it. We could make a beginning. We could go only up to some distance, but we could not go the whole way. Maybe it will happen in the next 10 years, 15 years, 20 years. Following that, I worked with human rights defenders, where I think I fully came into the human rights field. And here I was working with survivors of torture, of violence across different Asian countries, and also working at the same time with human rights defenders who had been abused and who had sometimes faced the worst of torture and dealt with issues in the solitary prison cells, and also did not know how to deal with the issues as they came out. Like, for example, many people come out after years after torture. Their perceptions of the world has changed. They no longer have that sense of attachment that they had. They are also disillusioned because the system has failed them. Their families, their friends have not come forward. So how do you deal with such people to give them back a sense of mission, a sense of going forward with what their issues were? So this was what my work was, and I found it deeply satisfying as I talked to a number of people and could help them find a mission. I remember one person whose husband had disappeared, and she was still hoping that she's a very well-known human rights defender, that he would be able to come back. And she asked me, "What do you do?" And I said, "I do grief work." And she asked me if she could do grief work with me. So we did grief work. I will not go into the steps of it, but it's a therapeutic process in which you let go of the grief. And after finishing the grief work, she said, "I understand my husband is no more. I have been holding on to that illusion that he is going to come back one day, but I know that he will not, he's no more, and I will give that up and I will forget him." So I told her that you will not forget him, you will change the way you feel about him, and you will feel very, in a way, free and sense of relief. That sense of almost pain that was choking you, maybe that would go. 2 months later, I got an email from her saying, "You're absolutely right. I'm working now at a higher level, at a deeper level, with my husband's memory guiding me. I'm no longer that little girl who's crying for my husband to come back." So this was a lesson for me as to how we psychologists can work with human rights defenders, with human rights issues, and help them to let go of the pain, the trauma that covers them, and be free of it. It has been a deeply satisfying work. I want to do this for the rest of my life and continue and carry on.